The rain slammed against the crooked roof of the Red Lantern as Matthew Brooks, bleeding and half-conscious, staggered into the storm with a broken girl clutched in his arms. Behind him, the guttural shouts of armed men grew louder, their footsteps pounding like war drums through the night. Every breath was a battle, every step a gamble between life and death, and yet Matthew refused to let go. But what happened next would shatter every rule of survival and prove that even in the darkest corners of hell, one act of courage can change everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The sun had barely set over the scorched plains of Clayton, Texas, when Emily Carter's life ended, not with a gunshot, but with a lie. For 14 years, Emily had weathered the storm that was her mother, Karen. She had grown used to the shouting matches with drunken boyfriends, the long nights when the house sat empty and cold, the mornings when Karen's sullen, hungover apologies spilled over burnt coffee. And yet, somewhere inside Emily, a stubborn ember of belief smoldered, that a mother's love, no matter how battered, could never be truly extinguished. That night, when Karen braided Emily's hair clumsily and packed a small satchel with trembling hands, she spoke with a smile so forced it made Emily's skin crawl. "You're going to a better place," Karen said, her voice cracking. "A real lady's house, fine clothes, schooling, a real future." The coach waiting outside wasn't elegant. It stank of sweat and tobacco. Emily hesitated on the threshold, clutching her threadbare satchel to her chest, but Karen gave her a rough shove forward, too quick, too eager to close the door behind her. The ride through town blurred into a haze of fear. The driver, a bloated man with yellowed teeth, offered no conversation, only leering glances in the half-light. Emily pressed herself against the far side of the carriage, a growing dread blooming in her stomach. They stopped not at a grand home, but behind the Red Lantern, an aging saloon known to the town's men but spoken of only in whispers among the women. The stench of stale beer and cheap perfume assaulted Emily as two rough-looking women pulled her from the coach and dragged her inside. The truth hit her harder than any blow. It ripped the air from her lungs, left her gasping on the dusty floor. She screamed Karen's name, once, twice, until her voice broke, but no one came. From a small window upstairs, Karen watched, her body hidden by the curtain, her knuckles white around a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Tears blurred her vision, but she made no move to stop it. She told herself that it was either Emily or both of them, that the men she owed wouldn't just take a pound of flesh. They'd bury her in a shallow grave by morning. The rationalizations came easy. The guilt clawed harder. And yet, deep in her heart, Karen knew she hadn't fought for her daughter. She had fought only for herself. Meanwhile, on the second floor of the brothel, Emily's world shrank to a dark room with a broken lock. Stripped of everything, her freedom, her trust, her very sense of self, she curled up on a lumpy mattress, a child abandoned to wolves. But even in that blackest moment, some fragile part of her refused to die. Maybe, just maybe, not everyone was like her mother. Maybe someone, somewhere, would still see her as a person worth saving. And that desperate hope, flickering like a candle in a storm, kept Emily alive for one more night. The Red Lantern breathed filth even in the cleanest hours of the morning, but at night it oozed rot from its very walls. Its oil lamps spilled sickly light onto warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper, illuminating faces drawn tight with vice and despair. It was here that Matthew Brooks found himself most nights, nursing a bottle of rye whiskey like a man clinging to a raft in a sea of ghosts. Matthew had wandered into Clayton with the dust, another forgotten drifter in a town where no one asked questions they didn't want answered. A decade in the army had left him with a body that healed slower than it broke, and a mind tangled with memories too jagged to smooth. He sought oblivion in whiskey and the steady clink of poker chips, telling himself he wanted nothing more than to drown quietly with the rest. That changed the night he noticed Emily. At first he thought his drink was playing tricks on him. A girl, barely more than a child, weaving clumsily through a sea of greedy hands and slurred propositions. Her dress, ill-fitting and ripped at the hem, did nothing to disguise the raw terror etched into her face. Wide green eyes darted in every direction, searching desperately for escape where there was none. Matthew's stomach twisted. He had seen horrors on battlefields, but this was a different kind of war. It was a slow execution carried out in the heart of his own country, under the watchful, indifferent eyes of civilized men. He said nothing at first. That was the law of places like the Red Lantern: see, hear, and forget. To break that law was to court death, and Matthew, while reckless, wasn't suicidal. But silence came at a price. Over the following nights, he watched. He watched Emily flinch when a hand brushed her arm. He watched the bruises bloom along her jawline, the forced smiles that never reached her hollow eyes. He watched Karen. He pieced together the connection quickly enough. Shuffle in once a week to collect a greasy wad of bills without sparing Emily so much as a glance. Each observation drove a splinter deeper into Matthew's already battered soul. The patrons were no better. Townsfolk who crossed themselves in church every Sunday and spent Saturday nights feeding on innocence. No one cared. No one would lift a finger. Hatred, once a distant hum, grew into a drumbeat pounding inside his skull. Hatred for Vernon Nash, the brothel's owner, a man who wore a gold ring shaped like a serpent and spoke with the lazy cruelty of a man who believed himself untouchable. Hatred for the sheriff who played cards with Vernon every Friday. Hatred for Karen Carter, whose betrayal was so monstrous it defied belief. Still, Matthew hesitated. He knew what happened to men who made noise in Clayton. They were lucky to vanish. Most were left where the coyotes could finish the work. And yet, night after night, as Emily withered before his eyes, the rage inside him edged closer to breaking free. A man could only drown his conscience for so long before it rose back up, gasping, clawing for air. Matthew Brooks was reaching the end of his whiskey-soaked apathy. The line between survival and decency was thinning, and somewhere deep down, he knew, soon he would have to choose which side of that line he was willing to die on. The storm cracked open the sky above Clayton, washing the dirt streets with freezing rain and cold fury. The Red Lantern groaned against the howling wind, its crooked sign thrashing wildly on rusted chains. Inside, the stale air was thick with sweat, whiskey, and something fouler: fear. Matthew Brooks sat at a poker table in the back room, a place where deals were sealed, not with handshakes, but with blood. Across from him, Vernon Nash lounged like a bloated spider, his beady eyes flickering with amusement. Around them, a few of Vernon's loyal hounds leaned against the walls, arms folded, eyes glinting in the low light. Matthew's hand was steady as he dealt the cards, though the hole in his gut screamed at him to run. Tonight, he wasn't a drifter. Tonight, he was a man gambling away the last thing he owned, his life, for a chance at redemption. The stakes were clear. One final hand, winner takes all. The prize, Emily Carter. Vernon laughed when Matthew proposed it, laughed long and hard, as if savoring a private joke. But greed was his god, and the chance to fleece a desperate fool was too sweet to pass up. He agreed with a sly nod, flashing his gold serpent ring as he shuffled the deck with thick, dirty fingers. The cards hit the table with the weight of gunshots. Matthew played his part to perfection, bluffing, baiting, pushing Vernon into overconfidence. When the final card turned, Matthew's hand beat Vernon's by a whisper. Relief flooded him for a breathless instant. Then he saw Vernon's smirk harden into something colder. A metallic glint flashed beneath the table. Without hesitation, Vernon pulled a small pistol from his belt, the barrel aimed square at Matthew's gut. But Matthew wasn't new to treachery. In a blur of movement honed by years of surviving worse than this, he kicked the table upward, sending chips and whiskey flying. The shot cracked, grazing his shoulder with a white-hot streak of pain. Blood sprayed the cards. Matthew lunged, his hand finding the hidden knife strapped to his boot. Vernon barely had time to curse before the blade sank deep into his side. The fat man screamed, a raw, animal sound, as he stumbled back, clutching his belly. The room erupted into chaos. The hired muscle, caught between loyalty and survival, hesitated. A second later, a chair shattered against the wall as they bolted, leaving their boss to die alone. Matthew staggered, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His vision swam, but he forced himself forward, kicking Vernon's pistol away. Blood pooled in slick puddles on the floorboards as Matthew found Emily in the corner, shackled, bruised, her small hands trembling with terror. With a grunt of pain, he broke her chains. She stared at him, unsure if this was another cruel trick. But when he whispered, "I'm getting you out," something in her broken gaze flickered back to life. The two of them burst into the storm, swallowed whole by the night. The wind howled like the dead as Matthew hoisted Emily onto a stolen horse, swung up behind her, and spurred it into a reckless gallop. Behind them, the Red Lantern's door slammed open. Shouts followed, men loyal to Vernon Nash, men who wouldn't rest until blood paid for blood. And so began their desperate flight through the blackened countryside, the rain lashing their faces, Matthew's strength ebbing with every drop of blood that soaked into his torn shirt. Every hoofbeat was a heartbeat stolen from death. Every mile was a question without an answer. How far could a broken man and a stolen child run before the past caught them? The desert wind shifted as Matthew and Emily crossed into the forgotten border town of Larkspur, a place too small and too worn to draw the attention of bounty hunters or men with long memories. Its cracked adobe walls and dusty streets offered no promises, no miracles, only a chance. And for two fugitives of the Red Lantern's cruelty, that was enough. Sheriff David Harris was waiting for them by the broken-down jailhouse, a heavy-set man with a slow drawl and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Matthew hadn't seen him since the war, when blood and dirt had made brothers of them both. No words were needed. Harris took one look at the hollow-eyed girl half-slumped over Matthew's saddle, at the makeshift bandages crusted with old blood, and simply nodded. Within hours, Emily was hidden under a new name, Eliza Moore, folded into the arms of a kind widow who had buried her own daughter years ago and had enough love left to try again. Emily said little those first days, her small frame stiff and wary, as if every kindness might still turn to ash. But slowly, with patience and gentleness, she began to thaw. She learned to smile again, shy and unsure at first, then brighter. She planted seeds in the dusty backyard, watched them grow into stubborn little blooms. She read books by oil lamplight, traced letters with careful fingers, dreamed timid dreams of a future not shaped by chains. And though the shadows of her past still haunted the edges of her sleep, they no longer owned her. She bore them like old scars. Painful, yes, but proof that she had survived. Matthew, for his part, refused to stay. He was a man built for storms, not quiet towns with sun-drenched porches and easy laughter. The gratitude offered by the townsfolk, hushed thanks, sidelong glances of respect, felt too heavy on his shoulders. He left one morning without ceremony, his saddle worn, his wound half-healed, carrying only the knowledge that he had done one thing right in a life otherwise crowded with regrets. Years slipped by like smoke through calloused fingers. When Emily found him again, he was a ranch hand on the far edge of the desert, skin darkened by sun, hair shot through with silver. She barely recognized him, until he turned and she saw those same weary eyes, softened only slightly by time. She crossed the dusty yard in 3 long strides and threw her arms around him before he could speak. Matthew stood rigid for a heartbeat, stunned, then let his arms fold around her in return. "You were the first person who ever chose me," Emily whispered against his chest, her voice shaking with all the words she'd never said. For the first time in decades, Matthew Brooks, the man who had outlived war, betrayal, and pain, felt something shatter inside him. Tears welled, unbidden, carving clean tracks through the dust on his weathered face. And in that moment, without banners or fanfare, justice was done. Not by gunfire or vengeance, but by stubborn love, by sacrifice, and by the sheer will to believe that even broken people could forge something pure from the ruins.